Welcome to Reform Thinking. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this comforting expectation of precision.
Right, like it's very clinical.
Yeah, it's like engineering. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it.
They say, there it is, that is the problem.
Right. It is binary, broken or not broken. You see it, you categorize it, and you fix it.
Human beings love when things are visible like that. We want a clear-cut problem with a clear-cut solution.
But then you step into the world of history and theology, specifically looking at the events around the crucifixion of Jesus, and suddenly that x-ray machine just shatters.
Yeah, the landscape gets, well, incredibly murky.
Right. On the surface, it looks like pure chaos. It looks like a complete breakdown of civil justice.
Just mob rule taking over.
Yeah, an innocent man swallowed up by a corrupt political machine. Today, we are taking you inside one of the most famous, brutal scenes in history.
But we are looking at it through a completely different lens for this deep dive.
We are going inside the Roman Praetorium, focusing on Matthew chapter 27, verses 27 through 31.
This is the moment where Jesus Christ is mocked, beaten, and given a crown of thorns by a cohort of Roman soldiers.
And our mission for this discussion is highly specific for you listening. We are going past the raw physical brutality of what those soldiers did.
Right. We want to see the cosmic theological transaction happening during this mock coronation.
Understanding how this moment of absolute public humiliation is actually the theater of Christ's supreme mediatorial glory.
It is a massive paradigm shift. But before we can analyze the theological weight of that crown of thorns, we first need to reconstruct the historical powder keg.
Yeah, because this did not happen in a vacuum.
Not at all. Let's set the stage. We are in 1st century Judea under Roman occupation.
And we have Pontius Pilate in charge as the Roman prefect.
Right. And looking at the historical context, both the Jewish philosopher Philo and the historian Josephus documented Pilate's tenure.
They paint a picture of a man named for severe political pragmatism and, well, sudden ruthless outbursts of brutality.
That political context is the engine driving the entire narrative. Pilate usually lived and governed from Caesarea Maritima.
Which was a very Hellenized, comfortable coastal city, right?
Yeah, the military capital of the province, right on the Mediterranean. He did not want to be in Jerusalem.
Jerusalem was basically a bureaucratic nightmare for a Roman governor.
Oh, absolutely. But during the major Jewish festivals, especially the Passover, he had to relocate his entire headquarters to Jerusalem.
Because the city's population would just swell with hundreds of thousands of religious pilgrims coming from all over the known world.
Right, so it is like an occupying military force trying to maintain order during a massive, highly tense nationalistic festival.
You have a suppressed population celebrating their historical liberation from a previous empire, Egypt, while currently living under the heavy boot of a new empire, Rome.
The atmosphere is completely ripe for an anti-Roman insurrection.
Yeah.
Everyone is on edge.
The zealots are looking for a reason to riot. The religious leaders are trying to maintain their fragile alliance with Rome. And Pilate is just trying to keep the lid on the boiling pot.
And because of that simmering threat, the Roman administration was hypervigilant. They were terrified of anyone claiming any sort of messianic or royal authority.
Because in the Roman worldview, claiming to be a king without the explicit approval of the Senate was direct treason against Tiberius Caesar.
The Roman peace, the Pax Romana, was maintained through absolute crushing force. Any spark of rebellion was met with immediate public execution.
So Pilate is in Jerusalem, and he sets up his headquarters at the Praetorium.
There is some historical debate about the location, whether it was the Antonia Fortress or Herod's palace.
But the current archaeological consensus points heavily toward Herod's palace. This is a massive, luxurious complex with huge courtyards, sprawling gardens, and large barracks for the troops.
And the troops stationed there are called a spera, a Greek military term for a cohort. We're talking about 400 to 600 heavily armed infantrymen completely taking over the courtyard.
The demographic makeup of that cohort changes everything about how we read this scene.
Right. These were not elite patrician Roman citizens recruited from the Italian peninsula. The troops stationed permanently in Judea were auxiliary forces.
They were recruited from the surrounding Gentile regions, places like Syria and Samaria.
That detail alters the entire psychological profile of the Praetorium. These specific auxiliary troops harbored a deep-seated historically documented hostility toward the Jewish population.
They despised Jewish customs. They viewed Jewish dietary laws and Sabbath keeping with suspicion.
And they looked at Jewish monotheism with a mix of contempt and superstitious dread.
You have to put yourself in the sandals of one of these soldiers. You are underpaid, you are stationed in a dusty, volatile province, and you are surrounded by a population that considers you ceremonially unclean and hates your presence.
You are working overtime during the Passover, sleeping in cramped barracks, constantly waiting for a riot to break out.
So when Pilate finishes his trial and hands Jesus over to this cohort, we have to recognize what is happening in the minds of those men.
Jesus was officially accused of being the king of the Jews. For the soldiers, their cultural and political frustrations suddenly found a focal point.
They catalyzed a very specific, calculated theater of cruelty. To these hostile, exhausted soldiers, Jesus was not just an individual prisoner.
He was a highly convenient physical punching bag representing the entire despised Jewish nation.
They could take out all their xenophobia, all the resentment of being stationed in this tense province on this one man who supposedly claimed to be the king of the people, making their lives miserable.
Which leads us directly into the mechanic of how they treated him. They decided to stage a counterfeit coronation.
Right, in the ancient Mediterranean world, the public mock coronation of a pretender king was a well-known theatrical custom.
It was used in street theater, in pagan festivals like Saturnalia, or in military sports to mock rival nations.
By subjecting Jesus to this ritual, the Roman cohort was asserting the supremacy of Rome over Judea.
They were demonstrating in a highly visual way that any Jewish claim to sovereignty would be met with immediate, agonizing degradation.
Let's unpack this theater of cruelty. The text breaks this down into a fourfold mock investiture.
The vestment, the crown, the scepter, and the title.
They basically repurposed everyday items laying around the military garrison for a crude parody of a Hellenistic imperial accession ritual.
First, the vestment. The Greek phrase used in Matthew is chlamyda kokinen.
The chlamys was a short wool military cloak, usually fastened at the right shoulder with a fibula, leaving the right arm free for combat.
Matthew specifies it was kokinos, a scarlet color derived from a Mediterranean insect dye.
Now, some other gospel accounts mention purple.
In antiquity, those color terms were applied broadly to luxury dyes, so a faded, cheap military cloak, stained with sweat and dust, could easily be described as either deep red or purple depending on the lighting in the courtyard.
The historical reality is the mockery itself. They used a cheap piece of standard military issue to simulate the imperial purple worn by Caesar or the royal robes of a monarch.
They are dressing him in the garments of the empire that is about to execute him.
Next is the scepter. They force a fragile reed into his right hand. The Greek word is kalamon.
It is just a stiff piece of marsh grass. The right hand is the traditional hand of authority and might.
A true king holds an iron scepter or a golden rod, signifying his ability to rule and crush his enemies.
Instead, they put this flimsy, easily broken stick in his hand to symbolize immense political impotence.
They are saying, this is the extent of your kingdom's strength, a piece of grass.
Then they move to the title and the homage. The text says gonipetasantes, which denotes the physical posture of falling on their knees.
And they shout chair, which is a direct parody of the imperial salute, Hail, Caesar.
They are executing a farce, acting out a twisted comedy routine, but the physical abuse quickly escalates from mockery to torture.
The grammar of the original text here is striking. When it describes the striking and the spitting, the Greek uses imperfect verbs, a tipton and an eption.
This indicates continuous rhythmic action in the past. It was not a single insult. It was a prolonged, repetitive assault.
They took that fragile reed, the kalamon, and repurposed it from a fake scepter into a weapon of torture, repeatedly beating the thorns into his head. The comedy routine became a blood sport.
It really did.
Here's what I struggle to wrap my mind around. How could these soldiers be so completely blind to the dramatic irony of their own actions?
It is wild, isn't it?
By staging this fake coronation, they were unwittingly declaring his actual identity. They're trying to make him look like a ridiculous clown, but they are literally setting up a visual representation of his cosmic authority.
They are proving the very point they are trying to mock.
Yeah.
That dynamic is a brilliant use of literary irony by Matthew. Every false sign points to a literal reality.
The soldiers intend blasphemous sarcasm, but divine providence is using their wickedness to set the stage for the true king.
They mock him as king of the Jews, but you, as the reader, know he is the true monarch of the universe.
They give him a reed to mock his weakness, but he actually possesses all authority in heaven and on earth.
They kneel in fake, sarcastic worship, but that action anticipates the coming day when every knee will bow truly in heaven and on earth and under the earth.
So they have rocked his clothes and his scepter with things lying around the barracks, a discarded cloak, a piece of marsh grass.
Right.
But then they do something completely unprecedented. They actually go out of their way to twist a crown out of thorns.
Why thorns? That requires effort.
Yeah, you have to find a thorn bush, cut it down without shredding your own hands, and carefully braid it into a wreath.
That specific choice carries a massive theological weight, and that detail dates back to the dawn of human history.
It brings us to the concept of the second Adam and the botanical curse.
We have to look closely at the language here. The Greek phrase for the crown of thorns is stephanon ex akanthon. The word acantha carries immense covenantal weight.
If you go back to the Greek Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, and you look at Genesis chapter 3, verse 18, you see the exact same word.
When the first Adam rebelled in the Garden of Eden, God pronounced a judgment on the ground itself, declaring that it would bring forth thorns and thistles, acanthas.
The thorn is the botanical signature of the fall. It is the physical monument of divine wrath against human sin.
So by choosing this specific plant, these Roman soldiers who are completely ignorant of biblical history and just looking for a way to inflict pain twist the very symbol of the divine curse into a crown.
And they force it onto the head of the Savior.
This illustrates the theological concept of federal headship. In Reformed theology, Adam acted as the federal head or representative of all humanity in the covenant of works.
Let me stop you there and offer an analogy for federal headship because that is a massive concept.
Sure, go ahead.
Think of a corporate structure. Imagine a CEO who signs a disastrous, fraudulent contract. Because he is the head of the company, his signature legally binds every single employee.
Right, the whole company goes down.
Yeah, when the company goes bankrupt because of his actions, every worker loses their job, their pension, their livelihood. They suffer the consequences of an agreement they did not personally sign because their representative signed it on their behalf.
Adam was that first CEO. He broke the covenant, and humanity inherited the spiritual bankruptcy and the curse.
That hits the mark perfectly.
Adam's rebellion plunged the entire human race into debt and condemnation. Christ enters history as the second Adam, acting as the new federal head for his people.
He is the new CEO stepping in to absorb the debt of the failing company.
In the Praetorium, he is physically and legally absorbing the curse of that broken covenant into his own person. He is literally wearing the condemnation of humanity on his brow.
The thorns are the visible proof that he is dealing with the Genesis curse. It is like a physical receipt of humanity's debt being forcefully pressed into his skin.
The spikes pierce his forehead, causing his blood to flow down his face. This is the core mechanism of substitutionary atonement. He is undergoing the punishment due to us.
This dynamic is where we see what theologians call the Great Exchange.
Christ wears the scarlet robe of shame, which represents our guilt and our treason against God, so that his people can wear the spotless white robes of his imputed righteousness.
He holds the fragile reed, embracing human weakness and frailty, so that he can shatter the iron scepter of Satan.
He takes our crown of thorns, the curse of the ground, so we can receive the crown of life.
The entire scene in the Praetorium is a visual representation of this transaction. He takes what is ours so we can have what is his.
To bear the full weight of this historic curse, the physical battery, the extreme social defilement of being spat upon, well, it requires an unnatural stamina.
Which brings us to the loudest action Christ takes in the entire Praetorium narrative, his absolute silence.
Despite the continuous assault, the rhythmic beating with the reed, the mocking cheers of hundreds of soldiers, he offers zero resistance.
He summons no angels. He utters no threats. He does not plead for his life or try to explain himself.
This silent endurance leads us into the Reformed soteriological concepts of active and passive obedience. Both are on full display in the courtyard.
His passive obedience is his willingness to endure the physical and psychological penalties of our transgression. He is voluntarily absorbing the wrath of God in our place.
He is not just passively letting things happen to him, he is actively receiving the penalty.
His active obedience is his unbroken compliance with the Father's command to lay down his life.
He maintains absolute holiness, perfect patience, and love for his people, even while being abused by pagan hands. He never sins in his response to the sin being committed against him.
Looking at this systematically, we can also frame this within Christ's threefold office: prophet, priest, and king.
During the Jewish trial with the religious leaders earlier in the night, he was mocked as a prophet. They blindfolded him, struck him, and told him to prophesy who hit him.
Here, in the Roman Praetorium with the Gentiles, he is mocked as a king. But in his silent suffering, while the soldiers are treating him like a joke, he is actually acting as the high priest.
He is the priest preparing the sacrifice, and he is the lamb being offered. The writer of Hebrews notes that Christ suffered outside the gate to sanctify the people.
In this framework, the Praetorium functions as the outer court of the temple.
It is the place where the sacrifice is prepared, where the animal is inspected, bound, and marked with the signs of the curse before being led to the altar of Golgotha.
His silence is the silence of the sacrificial lamb before its shears, as prophesied in Isaiah 53.
That's right. I mean, spot on.
I want to push back on this idea of silence for a moment, because in modern culture, silence in the face of physical abuse is usually interpreted as helplessness. It is seen as victimization.
Right. People see it as giving up.
Our modern mindset says that if you have authority, you assert it. You
Right.
fight back. You speak your truth. You defend your boundaries.
Yeah.
How is this silence actually a display of absolute sovereignty and not just tragic victimization?
Because if someone is hitting you and you say nothing, the world says you are just weak.
Yeah, precisely.
Christ's silence is not a sign of physical helplessness. It is a display of priestly resolve. To understand this, we look at how the Westminster Confession articulates the doctrine of providence.
God ordains whatsoever comes to pass without being the author of sin.
The soldiers in that courtyard are sinning freely and culpably. Nobody is forcing them to twist the thorns or spit on him. They are doing it because they want to.
But God is sovereignly using their wickedness in the redemptive path.
Christ is not trapped by Roman legions. He previously stated he could call down armies of angels. He is voluntarily submitting to the Father's will to fully satisfy divine justice.
His silence is not the silence of a victim who has run out of options. It is the silence of perfect obedience from a king who is choosing to endure the cross for the joy set before him.
That holy, silent resolve acts as a stark contrast to the unholy active hostility of the soldiers. The narrative uses that contrast to expose a grim reality about the natural human heart.
The focus moves from the individual actions of a few guards to the corporate nature of the scene, highlighting the concept of total depravity.
Notice that Matthew highlights the gathering of the entire cohort, holanton spirin. This is not a couple of rogue guards in a back room secretly abusing a prisoner.
This is a massive corporate gathering. 400 to 600 men in a courtyard, feeding off each other's energy.
Theologically, this is the historical manifestation of Psalm 2.
The psalmist asks, "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed."
In the Praetorium, that universal conspiracy described in the Psalms is realized in real time.
The Roman cohort represents the height of Gentile political and military achievement. They are the enforcers of the greatest empire on earth. They are completely united in hostile defiance against God's sovereign authority.
This demonstrates the absolute, structural, total depravity of the human race. The doctrine of total depravity teaches that apart from regenerating grace, the natural response of human institutions, whether religious, civil, or military, is to unite against God.
This scene proves that fallen humanity does not just misunderstand Christ, it actively resents his authority.
When the king appears in meekness, sinners exploit that meekness as though it were weakness. They do not look at his silence and feel pity. They look at his silence and escalate their violence.
Total depravity means that the human will is entirely hostile to the things of God. The contrast between their outward posture and inward reality is chilling.
They are saying orthodox words, "Hail, King." They are taking a posture of worship by kneeling.
But their hearts are full of absolute hatred and unbelief. I liken this to someone singing hymns on a Sunday morning, using all the correct religious vocabulary, taking the right posture during the service, but then living in total venomous rebellion on Monday.
The outward form of worship is present, but the inward reality is pure hostility. They are mocking the very idea of submission.
Matthew's narrative invites you to distinguish outward religious gestures from genuine faith. A person can say orthodox words with a blasphemous heart.
The soldiers prove that you can physically kneel before Jesus and remain his absolute enemy. The outward action means nothing if the heart is not regenerate.
We also see a structural symmetry in the Passion narrative that implicates everyone. It was not just the Romans.
The Jewish religious leaders provided the religious condemnation during the night trials, rejecting him for blasphemy. Now the Gentile Roman soldiers are providing the physical execution and mockery for sedition.
The structural symmetry shows that the whole world, Jew and Gentile alike, stands guilty and implicated before the tribunal of God.
No single demographic group exhausts the meaning of human guilt. Religious hypocrisy, political cowardice, mob passion, and pagan violence all gather against the Lord's anointed.
Christ is physically isolated in the midst of this overwhelming collective force, highlighting the solitary nature of his substitutionary work.
He stood alone against the raging of the nations, so his elect would never have to stand alone before the judgment seat. He took the concentrated hatred of humanity upon himself.
Realizing the universal nature of this rebellion is key to understanding how the author, Matthew, intended his original readers to process this brutal text.
We have to look at the first century audience. Matthew wrote this gospel primarily for Jewish Christians who were dealing with immense pressure.
They were facing excommunication from their local synagogues, losing their social standing, their families, their businesses.
And on top of that, they were facing mounting Roman persecution. They were being targeted by the state.
To the ancient Jewish mind, a Messiah who allowed himself to be stripped, spit upon, and beaten by uncircumcised Gentiles was a massive stumbling block.
It completely contradicted the popular rabbinic expectations of a triumphant military leader. They expected a new David, a warrior king who would ride into Jerusalem, smash the Roman yoke, expel the legions, and reestablish the kingdom in political splendor.
Instead, they get a Messiah who is bleeding in a Roman courtyard.
So put yourself in the shoes of a first-century Jewish Christian. You are reading about your Savior being stripped and humiliated like this?
How does that bring you comfort? Wouldn't that just terrify you? It seems like it proves Rome is untouchable, that the empire always wins.
Matthew's design in detailing these horrors is to shift their gaze from an earthly kingdom to a spiritual one. He wants to demonstrate that this structural humiliation was not a failure of the messianic plan.
It was the precise path ordained by God for the conquest of sin. By showcasing the absolute control of Jesus through his silent majesty, Matthew comforts his readers.
It anchors their endurance. If the master was treated this way, the servants should expect the same. It normalizes their suffering.
It strips Rome of its pretension to absolute sovereignty. To early Christians, the Roman Empire appeared omnipotent. They had the legions, the roads, the wealth, the absolute authority of life and death.
But Matthew portrays the Roman military machine as a group of blind, foolish actors. They are merely, they are just puppets, executing the sovereign decree of the God of Abraham.
Caesar's soldiers think they're in charge. They think they are the ones dispensing justice, but they are unwittingly facilitating the true king's coronation.
That realization validates the suffering of the early church. It reminds them that their king is sovereign over every earthly empire.
The kingdoms of this world, no matter how terrifying they appear in the moment, will finally bow before the throne of the crucified Lord.
It is a call to radical endurance and holy defiance against corrupt earthly structures. You do not need to feel the empire because the empire is just a tool in the hands of your God.
And that mandate to reject corrupt earthly structures translates directly to you, the modern listener. Now, applying this text to the modern framework of the church and society yields some fascinating conclusions.
When you look at how the theological principles in the Praetorium confront contemporary cultural movements, you start to see why this text is so disruptive.
First, looking at the prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel suggests that Christ died to secure earthly wealth, perfect health, and material success for his followers.
But looking at a Savior who was stripped of everything, beaten, and crowned with thorns contradicts that entirely.
True discipleship involves taking up a cross, embracing suffering, and walking the path of humiliation, not acquiring a fleet of private jets or earthly luxury.
The Praetorium narrative also confronts the seeker-sensitive movement. This is the approach to church that tries to make the gospel as acceptable, comfortable, and unoffensive as possible to the natural man.
The strategy is to remove any harsh edges so people will fill the seats. But the events in the courtyard show that the message of the cross is fundamentally offensive to the carnal mind.
It is a message about a bloody, mocked Savior dying for rebels. Attempts to sanitize the gospel into a harmless self-help program diminish the reality of Christ's suffering and the severity of human sin.
You cannot market the crown of thorns.
Then, applying this text to secular philosophies like critical race theory and liberal social justice frameworks, the argument built into these frameworks is that they seek to solve human problems primarily through political restructuring, identifying victim and oppressor groups, and dismantling social hierarchies.
However, looking at the text of Matthew, the root problem of humanity is exposed as something far deeper. The problem is not just systemic social structures. though those can be corrupt.
The root is the systemic infection of sin in the human heart. The soldiers, the politicians, the religious leaders, they all suffer from the same fatal disease of rebellion against God.
This infection is curable only by the substitutionary blood of Christ, not by secular political realignment or societal training programs.
Finally, the text models complementarianism. Christ exhibits true headship in this passage. He does not rule through tyrannical domination or forceful, self-serving control.
He rules through sacrificial, patient submission for the protection of his bride, the church. He takes the beating so she does not have to.
The theological application here is that husbandly headship should mirror this self-sacrificial love, willingly stepping into harm's way, laying down one's life, and absorbing the cost for the sanctification and safety of the family.
I anticipate a strong reaction from a listener at this point. We have talked a lot about total depravity, universal hostility, and the sheer wickedness of the human heart.
Doesn't focusing so heavily on human depravity make this a very bleak worldview? It feels heavy to constantly look at human nature through the lens of those violent soldiers.
It feels pessimistic.
It is an intensely heavy view of human nature. It is devastating to the human ego. But the theological argument is that the bleakness of the Praetorium is required to see the brilliance of grace.
You cannot appreciate the cure of substitutionary atonement until you accurately diagnose the fatal disease of sin.
If sin is just a minor flaw, a mistake, a lack of education, then the cross is a massive, grotesque overreaction by God. Why go through the beating and the thorns for a minor character flaw?
But if sin is cosmic treason, an active hatred of God, as depicted so clearly by the soldiers in the Praetorium, then the voluntary substitution of Christ is an act of incomprehensible mercy.
The dark background of our guilt is necessary to make the light of the gospel visible. You have to know how sick you are before you fall at the feet of the physician.
That brings our discussion to its final conclusions. When we look at Matthew 27, we are looking at the great exchange in its rawest, most visceral form.
Christ wore the dirty scarlet robe of shame so his people could wear spotless garments of righteousness.
He took the crown of thorns, absorbing the botanical curse of Genesis, to secure a crown of life.
The fake, mocking worship offered by those soldiers demands that we look at our own lives.
It forces us to ask if we are just offering outward conformity or if we're offering true, unconditional surrender to the sovereign monarch.
I want to leave you with a final thought to consider, something that builds on this reality but extends past the crucifixion.
Consider the physical body of Jesus, the very same physical body that bore the scars of the thorns, the spit on his face, the bruising from the reed, and the lacerations from the whip. That exact physical body was resurrected.
And right now, that body is seated at the right hand of God. The physical markers of his deepest humiliation did not disappear in the resurrection.
They are now the eternal proof of his highest glory, visible forever in the heavenly throne room. The scars remain as the lasting physical evidence of the great exchange.
The X-ray of history might look murky at first glance, showing us a landscape of chaos, political corruption, and unchecked brutality.
But when you look closely at the theology driving the historical events, you see the breathtaking precision of divine providence. You see the true king, conquering not with iron legions and swords, but through the triumph of substitution.
Thank you for joining us on Reformed Thinking.